Senator Simons.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
To speak to Bill C-5, an act to enact the Free Trade and Labour Mobility Act in Canada Act and the Building Canada Act. But I rise today haunted, in a sense, by a ghost of a bill we passed in this chamber in 2019, Bill C-69. You might say my entire time in the Senate has been stalked by the looming presence of C-69. The first time I ever rose in the Senate was on the day of my swearing in, October 16th, 2018. Now, it is certainly unusual for a senator to speak on her very first day in the Senate. But the day of my swearing in happened to coincide with the presence of Amarjeet Sohi, who was then the Minister of Natural Resources, who was here for ministerial question period. I had known Minister Sohi for years because he was an Edmonton City Councillor when I was the city columnist for the Edmonton Journal. So I wanted to ask him a question, not just to say hello, but specifically about Bill C-69, the amended Impact Assessment Act, which was tremendously controversial in Alberta. When I told the clerk that I would like to ask a question minutes after being sworn in and before joining any group, she laughed and told me that that was likely not possible. But to humor me, she put my name on the question list at the very, very bottom. And I was as surprised as I was delighted when the Speaker, George Fury, allowed me to ask the very last question of the afternoon, specifically about whether the environmental impact assessment rubric for C-69 would take into account the downstream impact of fossil fuel consumption. When I gave my first speech in the Senate 3 weeks later, it wasn't a personal speech about my family or my life's work. It was instead about Bill C-69. That bill was supposed to make the approval of new major projects, such as interprovincial power lines, pipelines, port expansions, rail lines, more reliable. There had been a problem, let's recall, with major projects making it most of the way through the environmental assessment process, only to have court challenges to those assessments derail big projects at the last minute. Project proponents were asking for more assurance up front that they wouldn't have the rug pulled out from them under them at the very last minute. And at the same time, Indigenous peoples and environmental groups were demanding better consultation so that their voices and concerns were considered during and not at the end of the process. We need a better, more transparent, and more nimble process to improve pipeline infrastructure, I said. We need an efficient, effective regulatory regime that gives investors some assurance that projects will actually be built. I continued, but that doesn't mean running roughshod over environmental concerns or over Indigenous sovereignty. Indeed, the only way we can create a regulatory system that provides investor confidence is by having an open, comprehensive, and comprehensible template to ensure that the environment is protected and that First Nations and Métis settlements are respected partners in the collaborative process. Well, that was true in November of 2018, and it remains every bit as true today. Sadly, however, C-69, the Impact Assessment Act, never became that template. And I greatly fear C-5 won't get us there either. C-5, after all, is supposed to do what C-69 was supposed to do: give proponents clarity up front and give First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities a meaningful voice. But I worry that in our rush to fix C-69, which was, let's recall, supposed to fix CIA 2012, the Harper government's Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, we may end up right back where we started, with Indigenous voices marginalized and environmental concerns sidelined. That's not only a problem for the honor of the Crown and the future of our environment. Far from giving certainty to project proponents, it could just fuel more court challenges, more protests, and more confusion. Shortcuts make long delays. C-5 could end up backfiring, stalling projects that we actually do need. Now, C-69 certainly was not rushed through the Senate. After significant debate, we sent it to the Standing Committee on Energy and the Environment for thorough study. We heard from hundreds of witnesses from the energy sector, the mining sector, the transportation sector, environmental groups, Indigenous nations and organizations, from premiers and academics and industry analysts. We held public hearings all across the country, in Vancouver, Calgary, Fort McMurray, Saskatoon, Winnipeg, St. John's, Halifax, St. John, and Quebec City. And when I say public, I mean public. We were interrupted by protesters in Calgary who feared the bill would cripple Alberta's energy economy. In Winnipeg, environmental and Indigenous protesters stopped the hearings for a time, marching through the hotel ballroom where we were sitting. Then it came time for amendments. I remember as a rookie senator watching in a kind of awe as Senators Howard Wetston and Yuen Pao Wu took the bill, which was a shaggy mess, apart and put it back together with some kind of logic. In the end, the Senate passed 188 amendments to the bill, and the government accepted 99 of them in whole or in part. Yet even after those amendments, the Act was still seriously flawed. The parts of it which dealt with major projects within one province have largely been struck down as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of Canada. Meantime, the legislation has been blamed, fairly or not, for the apparent paucity of big projects approved since its inception. C-5, of course, attempts to fix that by allowing the government to pre-designate certain proposals as projects of national interest, PONIs, if you will. Once a project is pre-designated as a PONI, the bill would allow it to be fast-tracked through the environmental and other regulatory approval processes. If things don't move fast enough, well, the bill would give the super minister responsible for PONIs the power to skip over the requirements of a long list of legislation, such as the Fisheries Act, the Migratory Birds Convention Act, the Canada Marine Act, or the Impact Assessment Act itself, the very laws meant to safeguard our environment. Just before they rose, our colleagues in the other place did pass some smart last-minute amendments, as Senator Housakis mentioned, that curtailed the powers of the super minister to run roughshod over other pieces of legislation, including the Indian Act and the Canada Labour Code. They added amendments to improve transparency of the process and to ensure that provinces and territories would be fully consulted. They removed the most problematic and obviously abusive parts of the Henry VIII Clause, which would have given the governor and council sweeping and unacceptable superpowers. So this version of C-5 is better than the original, but it remains deeply flawed. The bill still front-end loads the approval process by asking for consultation and accord with affected parties to designate something a national interest project before the environmental and other impact assessments are done. This prejudging could lead to problems if a project that has been granted PONI status and then experts subsequently learn that the project could present a major risk, say to a whale calving site or nesting grounds of a rare and endangered bird or a groundwater aquifer. And I worry, too, that designating something as a project of national interest in itself could taint the independence of any environmental analysis, since the project would go in with a special status. And the pace with which this bill has moved through the Parliament has, in and of itself, damaged hard-won relations of trust with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We have worked so hard on reconciliation in the last decade, this feels like a betrayal of so much of that work. This bill needed more debate and analysis than we were allowed to give it. Our Committee of the Whole hearings were useful, but we should have sent a bill this important to the Standing Senate Committee on Energy and Environment and the Standing Senate Committee on Indigenous Peoples for proper study. At the very least, I wish we had been given the politically unconstrained opportunity to make amendments of our own here. Instead, we've been painted into a corner because the bill has already been sent to us after the other place has risen. The government wants to move the conversation around vital nation-building projects, they say, from whether to how. Yes, some of the long list of preconditions required by Bill C-69 did seem purposely designed to be excuses to build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. But I worry that we're now overcorrecting in expediting megaprojects that may not be of local interest, even if they are of national interest. Frankly, I worry that the aura of urgency around Bill C-5 may create unrealistic expectations that may come back to bite this new government. Some of the rhetoric around this bill has created the unfortunate and false impression that the government itself will be funding a stable full of nation-building PONIs, that the government will be using this legislation to fix the Chinecto Isthmus, to build a pipeline to Prince Rupert, or a new rail line to Churchill, or a new all-season road to Norman Wells. When it becomes clear that there is no federal funding attached to this bill, I think there is likely to be disappointment and political backlash. So let us be clear. There is no Santa Claus. There is no Pink Poni Club where we're all going to keep on dancing. This bill is not a tickle trunk full of public infrastructure projects. It is primarily a bill about creating greater certainty for project proponents who are using their own capital to build projects that match market conditions. And if those private project proponents don't feel that C-5 gives them certainty, then we will have rushed here, running roughshod over the rights and sensibilities of Indigenous communities for naught. I want to end with a message to my fellow Albertans, especially those who made C-69 the scapegoat for every frustrated ambition. My Alberta friends, I want to speak to you directly, and directly to our political leaders who are playing with fire as they pander to separatists and racists and fan embers into flames. Albertans, If you really want a pipeline, be it to the Pacific or to the east, face some hard truths. No private enterprise is going to risk tens of billions of dollars to build that kind of national infrastructure if they think there is any chance Alberta could separate. A pipeline will only be built if there is a market case and investor confidence. Prime Minister Carney is giving you what you said you wanted, the de facto repeal of Bill C-69. If you throw that opportunity away by threatening to break up the country, on your heads be it. But I hope when it comes to nation building, Albertans can have an imagination beyond oil pipelines. What about a Western electrical grid that allows Alberta greater access to green hydropower from British Columbia and Saskatchewan greater access to green hydropower from Manitoba? What about passenger rail connecting Edmonton and Calgary? A network of blue hydrogen pipelines so that we can have hydrogen trains and buses and power plants. We need bold new projects that actually improve our environmental future by greening our grid and our transportation systems. We need projects that empower and employ and enrich Indigenous communities and accord them the respect they deserve legally and morally as full partners in Confederation. We need those projects for Alberta, for Canada, and for our collective futures. I wish we had not rushed this bill. I wish the Senate had been allowed to provide true, sober second thought to assure Canadians that this was the best possible legislation, to help build the national consensus this legislation will require if we really want it to work. Because in this moment of global crisis, when old alliances are crumbling and economic certainties are dissolving, we really do need to dream big, to build big, and to build a united nation with a sovereign future. I just don't know if Bill C-5 will get us there, or if, like the revenant of C-69 before it, it will come back to haunt us and thwart our vaulting ambitions. Thank you, merci, and hi-hi.